Hey everyone. So right now we're about to go into the Q&A for levels of development. If you haven't watched that video, go fucking watch that video. It's a crash course. We're probably gonna have to go back over more stuff from it, but please understand, if you haven't watched that, watch that first, because otherwise this shit won't make any sense at all. Like, full stop. Period. All right, so let's get started. Zena, would you read the first one?
Yeah, so this first question was posted after the other video, so this one's referencing the video about states. So, from Hello Brian, what's the easiest and safest way to experience these states of consciousness and remember them afterwards?
Okay, so what I would say is this. The best way to do this is, one, probably look into certain types of practices. Meditation's a really good one, especially concentration practice, or what's called dharana concentration practice. If you're trying to enter certain states of being, you kind of got to go to the people that do them, and you might have to get past your allergy of woo. The problem is that, as we just described with the development stuff, early people were very magical thinking, and the things that they were describing may not be an accurate description, but they do lead to outcomes. So I can't tell anyone on YouTube to do anything with any kind of substance. I can say that, how do I say this in the nicest way that's not going to get demonetized? Exogenous state training can be done, but should be done with absolute caution, right intention, and right environment, and for the right absolute reasons. Exogenous state training. Endogenous, or like meditation and stuff that you don't eat, that stuff can be just done, though I do think having a teacher and people like that would be great. I will probably cover state-based meditations at another point. Not super worried about them right now. But those would be what I say. The safest way to do that would be concentration practice, meditation. Zen was the thing that worked for me. Do not move, stay present, yada yada. Okay? What's the next question?
All right, so this goes starting from today's video from Ash. Is it possible to be in multiple states at once with this model? Can you be in one of the higher states and still believe in a higher power?
Sure, and I can even do you one better. So, real quick, if you look over here, you can actually see how these interact. Right? We talked about this briefly, but essentially what this comes down to is each stage of development cognizes a different state in a different way. So I'll use Jesus because everyone knows who the fuck that guy is, right? So at the lower stages, Jesus is the dude who makes water into wine. He can perform magic. He walks on fucking water. We should listen to that dude because he can do cool shit. At these stages of development, Jesus is, the lawbringer, the one who is the true king, right? The king of kings. And at these stages, right, Jesus is a cultural manifestation by which we can sort of channel or understand the ideas of love and communion. Notice the jumps there? They're very different. Each of these states is affected by or changed by the consciousness it's being observed in. Now, to answer your question of whether these states can be in there, so higher is not a great language for these, but I would say that in a non-dual state, in my experience, it is possible to experience the subtle and the causal. There's just no separation from them. Right? That is, because it's non-dual by its nature, it doesn't make these go away. In fact, you realize that the gross, subtle, and causal are just always interplaying at the moment. They're just there. A really good example of this is like doing witness-based meditation when you're doing like shamanic training or shit like that I've done, where like you can be witnessing yourself doing this practice, which is really fascinating. So yes, you absolutely can do that. And you can believe in a higher power, right? But usually it comes from a much more higher consciousness ideal, right? So for example, if we're talking about, let's use Sufism, which is something I've been named into. though I have to get that name changed because it's a boy name. In Sufism, right, the idea of Allah is ultimate reality. The idea of in some ways, enlightenment, or Allah goes beyond just the idea of like a sky daddy, but something much, much more complicated, much larger. There are Sufis I know who are absolutely non-dual practitioners. Lex Hickson, who wrote Coming Home, great example. His major school of thought was Sufism. Absolutely believes in a higher power, but not from the previous stages of development angle that we normally would. It's not that there's this magical sky god, it's that we're talking about ultimate reality or God as the universe or whatever you want to fucking, whatever random thing you can find in a card for a white bitch. That is sort of a representation of this larger sort of experience, right? So, what is considered... Oh, go and read that one.
Oh. From Minerva, what is considered role confusions under rational self?
Let's go look at it and find the fuck out. Roles confusion. Oh, I would say with this one, what it's referring to is that roles start to break down, right? So in these ones, roles are absolute. In these ones, I would actually say this is where you start getting things like second wave feminism, right? That deconstructs the roles as they exist, right? That's looking at that. Even gender, like you could make an argument that early on trans folks, this was based on this, probably this stage of development. It's actually really interesting because being trans and all the things that lead to being trans are actually much more higher stages of development concepts, which is why a lot of people down here can't understand them. It's why transphobes, TERFs, and other idiots go, you know, your biology is who you are. Well, no, who you are is actually a much more complicated question. So I would say that's what roles confusion is. It's you don't really know where you exist or stand. For example, the big one I think that women got hit with was you can both be the girl boss and also be the mom, and how do you balance those things like that? So I think that's what that's pointing at. Okay.
All right. So also from Minerva, can you bypass earlier stages by yourself, and or with help, or do you have to go through them the hard way?
So the short version is everybody starts at 0 and no one skips any. The only way you skip these is by going backwards, and that's basically head trauma. That's it. I would say that basically you have to go through all these. Now, you may only stop in one and smell the roses for 5 minutes. Some of them you might live in forever. It just depends. Now, what I would say to this is that there seems to be practices from some of the research I've seen that do move you further on this. Meditative practices, things like yoga, Zen meditation, etc., seem to be able to push you further up this. Also, higher education, that can do a thing. Reading philosophy, right? Whatever you could do to get into these different aspects of yourself to sort of push yourself up these levels, there seems to be something to that, right? So you have to go through them the hard way. It's just different for everybody. It seems like they seem to flow into one another. Some people stay at one for a minute. Some people stay at the same one forever, a la, 70% of people in the country, a la the 70 million that voted for Trump, probably being around here-ish, right? He's so powerful. Anyway. Let's go to Andi. Let's call Andi.
Would you say the self exists across multiple areas in this formulation? Having higher ideals, but operating in the punitive nil-sum space, i.e., no left unity. How does this mesh with your understanding of the Buddhist appeal to beginner's mind?
And then Andi was like, we're fucking...
There's a lot here.
There's a lot here. Holy shit. Andi, well done. So let's get into this. So would you say the self exists across multiple areas in this formation? Yes. If the formation you're talking about here is development, I would say that when we talk about lines next time, different aspects of you can be at different places. The example I always give is someone like, say, the character Dexter. Dexter is brilliant. Dexter would probably be, based on the way he thinks about the world, at very least rational self, if not some sensitive self. He has an understanding that's way beyond just these lower levels. But values-wise, that is how he looks at the world, he basically thinks he's a fucking superhero. Right? So his intellect is here, and his values are fucking here. So yes, you can exist over multiple formations because we can talk about those as multiple intelligences, etc. Having higher ideals but operating in a punitive null space. Yes, no left unity. I would say no left unity is due to the inherent dysfunctions of these stages of development, further complicated by these interactions, either by right-leaning people or, I'll be honest, I think a lot of the really toxic stuff that goes on online is heartless irony. Like, I honestly think that the inability to read media or perceive media falls into a lot of the tendencies to immediately, like, again, lacks discernment. The tendency is to be reactive. Actually, Hollow Brian, despite the stupidity of that question, I love you, but what the fuck? I would actually say trans-friendly, gay as fuck for Spider-Man, seems to really just like people as a whole. Boop, I would probably say hereish, but usually plays around here. But as a father, do you have any recommendation for reading for parents, especially one with a history of mental illness? So if you want a really good book, I like Tiger, Tiger, Is It True? By Byron Katie. I think that's a really good video, or a really good book for starting to point kids into how to deconstruct their thoughts. Basically, it starts with a little tiger. Tiger's having a bad fucking day, and it gets into him asking 4 questions that any kid can ask themselves that can kind of start deconstructing things. That would be the best way to say that. The other thing I would say is the best thing you could do is get yourself into therapy. Get yourself into therapy, your partner into therapy. Fuck, do family therapy if it's needed. The more you work on yourself, the more that it improves the overall environment for your kid, which then improves things as a whole. You don't realize how much your atmosphere of your being around them is an impact.
I would also say if there are other concerns with, like, they may need accommodations or other things, get those as soon as possible. That would probably be a big one. If you are finding that there are learning aids that they need, no, really, get on board. Get professionals involved, right? So.
Yeah, and I would say that as this, how does this mesh with your understanding of Buddhist appeal to beginner's mind? So the best way to describe that is that from my perspective, if we're talking about beginner's mind, what we're talking about is resting in fundamental unknowing, right? So I'll hit you with 3 questions real quick. Is it possible to just purely listen? Can you listen without an opinion? Where is that deeper listening located? And from this depth of deeper listening, who are you? Now, to all the atheists and assholes, they're going to ignore all that and think it's random nonsense. That's fine. But the people who give a shit, listen to that. Listen to those questions. Is it possible to just purely listen? Where is that deeper listening located at within the body? And from that depth of deeper listening, who are you? I would argue that those 3 questions are a lead-in, from a Zen perspective, into getting into a notion of fundamental unknowing. That is, I don't know who I am. I don't know who they are. I don't know who all you are. In fact, it's a radically accepting way of recognizing that my way of interacting with the world, and everybody seems to be doing this, is based on a series of projections and perspectives put out into the world. The simple fact of the matter is, by resting in a place of unknowing, that is beginner's mind, always starting from beginner's mind. By definition, you can start moving through these stages, or at least have a better time in them, because you're no longer necessarily always getting stuck in the same place. That doesn't mean therapy isn't necessary or there's other things, but if we're talking about from a purely spiritual, purely Buddhist perspective, step back and recognize that you have a perspective, and you have a perspective on that perspective, and then you have a perspective on that perspective. You go far enough back in that chain, eventually you realize you can have a pretty good feeling of your sense of self, and you have a perspective on that too. The question I always ask people, and they always hate this question, what is aware of you? If you can look at yourself, if you can describe your sense of self, then it's not a subject, it's an object. So, if that's the case, What's aware of that? Have fun with that. Took me years of meditation to get that fucker right. Anyway, let's move on. Let's do Saul.
Saul. Cool. All right. Is it possible for ideas that emerge from certain stages to remain even if society or individual persons fall back to an earlier stage of development? If so, how do they change?
Absolutely. I would actually argue that that's how these stages erupt. You have people who, for whatever reason, due to situations, due to environment, due to the right amount of, this is going to sound awful, but either the right amount of really good resources or somehow the weird alchemical mixture of trauma somehow boinks themselves up to a much higher stage, and they might be actually different than the rest of society. I think that's where we get some of the people that we do. I would say that Marx was probably smarter than a lot of motherfuckers that were around at his time. Probably most of them, right? Same thing with Socrates. What I would say to this is that in some ways, your development exists both in the individual sense as well as the social and the systemic sense. The reason why I say this is we want to differentiate those. If society as a whole drops a level of development, it doesn't mean everybody does. It just means that there's a pull of the gravity of it, right? The water pull goes down, all the ships go down too. A good example of this would be after 9/11, when the country kind of had a sudden shock that we weren't invincible. I don't know who was alive at that time. I was, and it was fucking awful. Basically, it was just a reduction of development. Everybody fucking through trauma basically went to a place where all of a sudden, spoiler, we were all really okay with authoritarianism. Gotta love them freedom fries. All right. And if so, how do they change? It has to do with basically environmental factors. I gotta pull a Bosch on that one. Next one.
So, Looney, is there a success/failure or task-based milestone tied into these similar to Erikson's stages? Or is it like Piaget? Piaget, there we go. Piaget's
French.
ideas of being stuck in a stage. And are micro/macro systems capable of limiting progress in that regard?
Yes. I'm going to just answer the last one. Yes. Full stop, yes. There are macro and micro systems within our society that hinder development. I would argue resources, environment as a whole. I mean, rewatch Contra's video on Baltimore and lead paint. Look at the way food deserts function. There are numerous ways that we fuck people on a micro and macro system level, developmentally speaking. Now, I have a chart for this. Boop. Let's go to here. Let's go to the chart, not that one. You'll notice right here, you're talking about Erikson. Well, is Erikson on this list? I don't know if Erikson is. Erikson isn't, but Piaget should be. No, he's not on this one either. God damn it, this is the wrong. Oh, no, Piaget, right there. Cognition.
Yeah.
Right? So here's the thing. We'll talk about these when we get into lines, but the essential argument is as follows. There are ways in which, at the levels of development that are going on, right? Erikson is talking about one particular review of development, that is these different milestones of personal self-development, right? I would say that would probably be a good example of that is like self. I would say that to some degree, that from that perspective, that's still in play here, but that's not the same line as development as the rest of these. This is what we'll get into with lines, but the short version is each of these are non-reducible to one another, and you can be at different places on all of them. Right? So yes, you can be stuck at a stage in Piaget's system because there's literally mechanical systems that prevent that, and milestones exist within Erikson's system, which I believe is, I think it's life. God, I haven't read Erikson fucking forever. Anyway,
it's been a while since I've been looking at that too.
His one always seems super boring to me. I just thought, to be honest. Anyway,
well, I think it usually dealt with
it was always this versus this. Yeah, it was like
education and learning, right?
It's like independence versus something else, and it always was like very binary and like, if this happens, great. If this doesn't, like, it was really clear like this becomes a path of failure. It's really weird. The last question we're going to do for the night is going to be Viri Rona, and then we're going to move on to other segments. So go ahead and read that last one.
All right. How the hell would I know where I am in this? I think I can be quite certain in the fact that I've gone beyond the rational self because I remember being there and I've grown beyond it. And I feel like I definitely got to sensitive self, at least if I'm not deluding myself. And the stuff beyond feels vaguely familiar.
I am never going to tell anyone where they are developmentally. I've had enough of that, I'll be honest. The reason for this is really simple. One of the major pitfalls, and we'll talk about this into why I stopped engaging with integral communities, is that this became a way in which to be incredibly elitist. I had a falling out with a lot of people over this kind of stuff. One of them was with a dear friend because we had different ideas of where I was at. And at the time, that meant a lot to me. Now, not so much. The biggest contention is that people would get results when they would actually get formally tested that didn't align with people's preconceived notions. The biggest one being like, I got testing done by Susan Cook-Reuter. She's a researcher. She's super cool. She goes through this whole thing. Now she's like turned it into some sort of coaching system. But like, basically it was you did sentence completion, which is how they do her system. And I'll bring you back over to the chart. If you look, right here, you'll look at this. Oh, God damn it. It's doing the thing. Okay, there. This one you can barely read. Loevinger, Cook-Reuter, Susan Cook-Reuter, self-identity, symbolic, impulsive, self-protective, conformist, consciousness, individualistic, autonomous, etc. I was pretty sure I was going to test around here-ish. That is not the result I got. Yes, you're at the highest level, you still understand Holobrain. What I actually got tested out as a construct aware, which is not on the stuff we've talked about today. Does that mean anything? Kind of, but it doesn't really mean anything in regards to anyone here, and it really doesn't mean anything as far as I'm concerned. My essential response to it when I got it was that I thought it would make my dating pool very small. That's not a brag, that's not a boast. It's just a simple thing of that stage of development as she has mapped it out basically is about being able to recognize within yourself the experience of a construct, such as the experience of gender internally, the experience, and not just as like a vague self-identified notion, but as something that is you recognize as sort of a cultural signifier description of a network of different perspectives, right? When I say love, I mean a billion things, right? So I would say if you understand this map at all, you're probably at least touching into what Wilbur would call like integral consciousness or some bullshit like that. It means that this stuff matters. His general experience was if you experience these stages of development less so as discrete worldviews and more so as like a palette, that is, you're sitting there and you have little paintbrushes. Like if I walk into one situation, I can act in rules role self. If I walk into another, I can come from a, power-based self. It was one of those things where whatever situation you walk into, you're able to recognize that part of the development in yourself and then act from there because you're no longer hindered by those levels of development. I think there's some reality to that, but again, I don't want to say where anyone's at. So last comment, and then we're going to end this part. Let's see here. We got an Andi said, so true about trauma and grief states heightening moments of clarity. I remember sitting in the hardest moments, loss of life. Yeah. So the term you're looking for is, this is something we don't talk about enough. We should do a video on that at some point. There is post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's also another thing called post-traumatic growth. This comes out of the school of positive psychology, and it is about, apparently there are people based on their experiences and their practices and things they do, that when traumatic events happen, it seems to less so damage or crack them, the way post-traumatic stress disorder does, and more so catapult them. That's not a value judgment between any other groups, but it's just a description of phenomenon. So something to consider there is that there's a reasoning behind some of this stuff. There's data to support why meditation, things like that are important. They really do work. They really do some really fantastic stuff, and there's some benefits as far as also resistance on certain things. Anywho, you think you were writing that down?
Yeah, got the idea down.
So with that said, I love you all. I want to get to the other segments, so I'm going to say that this segment's going to end here. So again, if you haven't watched the whole Integral series, go do that. All right? Otherwise, feel free to join the Discord. Feel free to put things into our questions for next time. We'll be covering lines next time and maybe get into the higher stages of development. All right? So listen to all the stuff I say at the end, but we're going to end this segment here. All right?
Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can also ring the bell if you want to be notified of our videos. If you want to help the channel, you can donate at streamlabs.com/transgirltherapist/tip. You also can become a patron at patreon.com/transgirltherapist. For as low as $3, you can support our channel. Thanks for watching.